Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we explore the philosophy contained within the works of one of America's greatest 20th century writers, F. Scott Fitzgerald, because 100 years since the publication of Fitzgerald's great novels, we, in many ways, are living in the same world as Nick Carraway, Amory Blaine, and Jay Gatsby. The lower classes are narrower, less pleasant, and personally more selfish, certainly more stupid. Those are some famous lines in one of F. Scott Fitzgerald's great novels. Fitzgerald, that great sage and cynic of American life, left to the country and the entire world a great treasure of Midwestern literary characters who are beaten down and defeated by the elusive allure and the lie of the American dream. Now, a century later, his writings seem prophetic of the very epoch we are restlessly struggling through, an epoch of change, transformation, and disappointment. As Nick Carraway laments near the end of The Great Gatsby, I see now that this has been a story of the West. After all, Tom and Gatsby, Daisy and Jordan and I were all Westerners, and perhaps we possess some deficiency in common which made us subtly unadaptable to Eastern life. Nick Carraway's lament is the realization of the broken and defeated spirit of infinity, and that which had drawn those Midwest souls to the East Coast only to end in alienation, defeat, and death. Nick's lament is symptomatic of another problem, waking up from the American dream to realize it was only an illusion. The veneer of parties, cars, grotesque materialism, and cafe society, once peeled back, reveal a horror of decadence, lust, and murder, a horror of emotional destruction and emptiness. In many ways, we can simply move The Great Gatsby into our world today and see the same problems of Instagram, TikTok, and the allure of the American dream, get rich quick, and immediate gratification and instantaneous fame on social media, only to wake up in the aftermath of it all, to realize it was an illusion, and that we are scarred with horror, the horror of emotional damage, the horror of not having actually attained that which we desired. F. Scott Fitzgerald was a Midwesterner himself, and it's important to remember when F. Scott Fitzgerald is writing that the West basically meant the Midwest at the time. The actual West Coast, the Pacific Coast, had not yet been born and become the great image that it is today. Born in Minnesota, F. Scott Fitzgerald was educated at Princeton, ventured to Paris, and met the great writer Ernest Hemingway. He returned to America and pursued his literary career, then died a pauper. His own life, sometimes vicariously reimagined in his literary characters, given to us in his great novels, was emblematic of the blues now overwhelming much of the United States, especially the heartland of his birth, which Fitzgerald continuously returned to, romantically and nostalgically, throughout his life. Two of Fitzgerald's enduring books deal with Midwestern transplants, living the dream on the East Coast, or thinking they're living the dream on the East Coast, only to be beaten, broken, and shattered through the twists and turns of urban life and the pursuit of the American dream. The Great Gatsby is, perhaps, Fitzgerald's most famous work, though Tender in the Night, in my opinion, is arguably his best. But This Side of Paradise, another one of his great works, a semi-autobiographical novel, centered on the ambitious Amory Blaine, and is equally as profound and prescient as The Great Gatsby. Beyond centering on Midwesterners living in the East, on the East Coast, raptured under the spell of the high life and boundless opportunity and social gain, both works also deal with the corrosive and corrupting effects that greed, materialism, and social climbing have on the most intimate reality of human life and the soul: love. When Nick Carraway first makes his way into West Egg, having returned from the First World War, he is immediately captured by the ambiance and the material splendor of his neighbor, Jay Gatsby. Carraway describes the scene, seductive and alluring, if not somewhat obnoxious, the more one thinks about it and reads it. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue garden men and girls came and went, like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. At high tide in the afternoon I watched his guests diving from the tower of his raft, or taking the sun on the hot sand of his beach, while his two motorboats slit through the waters of the Sound, drawing aquaplanes over cataracts of foam. Life is, for Gatsby, one big perpetual party and flaunting of his wealth, a projection of an image of wealth and importance. We can see how many people today do this too on social media. They're living and trying to project the same life as Gatsby. Not just to show off, of course. We later learn Gatsby has intention of seducing Daisy Buchanan, his old childhood flame, who married a Yale football star, Tom Buchanan, after Gatsby shipped off to France to fight in World War I. The veneer of parties has something, another, far deeper, another goal in mind. The description of Gatsby's mansion and his parties is the ultimate goal that Amory Blaine set out to achieve for himself in This Side of Paradise. Again, This Side of Paradise and The Great Gatsby are two works dealing with these great themes of a Midwestern transplant, seeking the high life in the East. Ego and vanity reign supreme in Amory Blaine and This Side of Paradise, as well as, frankly, The Great Gatsby. Only egotistical and vain individuals. Gatsby is certainly that as we begin to dissect his heart and soul over the course of his romance with Daisy, and egoism and vanity is what moves Amory Blaine. So only egotistical and vain individuals indulge in the luxurious pleasures of such a material life of parties, and more parties. As Amory Blaine mused, in a moment of honesty which captures the very destructive mindset of the so-called American dream, Amory wondered how people could fail to notice that he was a boy marked for glory, and when faces of the throng turned toward him and ambiguous eyes stared into his, he assumed the most romantic expressions and walked on the air cushions that lie on the asphalts of 14. Fitzgerald's description of Gatsby's mansions and parties, as well as Amory Blaine's being marked for glory mentality, perfectly embody the mentality and material manifestation of the American nightmare of self-conceited individualism and materialism that still clouds and blinds our own public imagination and perception of Silicon Valley and the East Coast establishment. While it is true West Egg is a stand-in for the ritzy parts of the Upper East Side and the New York elite, it is now read today in the 21st century as much a critique of the East as it is of the California coast. In fact, it is probably more akin to the West Coast than the East Coast today, for young men and women still enraptured by the dreams of fame and fortune, glory, as Amory Blaine called it, strike out to Los Angeles or San Francisco or Silicon Valley to attain that glory they feel they are entitled, rather than move to New York or the East Coast, although some still do that. In the dislocation, East and West to win the American dream, inland Americans shed their origins and take on new skin. It is undoubtedly true psychologically that Southerners and Midwesterners now suffer a sense of being scorned and hated by their coastal peers. One can only listen, for instance, to American political rhetoric to get this, as well as to listen to celebrities who mock flyover country. This, too, is something that seeps through the pages of Fitzgerald. Amory is a relatively wealthy boy, but abandons his home for the East to win that glory he is marked for. If one is marked for glory, as Amory thinks of himself, one cannot achieve it in the Midwest. Although the Midwest has plenty of culture and has plenty of wealthy individuals, only those who are truly marked for glory, marked for fame, can live in the East, and now in the 21st century, again, the West Coast. If you are going to be a somebody, as the great characters of F. Scott Fitzgerald's novels seek to be, you cannot do it in the Midwest. You cannot do it in the American South. When Nick Carraway returns from the war and decides to strike it rich, where does he go? He doesn't return to his Midwestern home. He heads to West Egg and remarks on his origins. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Amory Blaine and Nick Carraway honestly state the reality of the coastal snobbery that drives flyover country mad. The Midwest is, as Nick Carraway opines, the ragged edge of the universe. It's unimportant, it's ugly, it's nothing. The Midwest is a place that is uncouth, and a place, as Amory Blaine implies, that cannot satisfy the hunger for glory, wealth, and fame. Let the hicks and the hillbillies have the middle of the country. Thank God we no longer live there. Many elites, and wannabe elites in the United States, share that mentality. We can go further on this account. Amory, while at Princeton, openly embraces the hectic hustle and bustle of the East. He desperately wants to become something he is not, a wealthy Anglo-Saxon Protestant. While he has a romantic friendship with a Catholic priest, Monsieur Darcy, who tries to shepherd Amory's literary talents by also revealing to him the richness of the Catholic literary and artistic tradition, Amory nevertheless keeps everything not WASP at a distance. He does not want to be associated with that which is not upper class and breathlessly aristocratic. Amory missed the place he had won at St. Regis's, the being known and admired. Yet Princeton stimulated him, and there were many things ahead calculated to arouse the Machiavelli latent in him. Could he be but inserted into a wedge? The upper-class clubs, concerning which he had pumped a reluctant graduate during the previous summer, excited his curiosity. Ivy, detached, and breathlessly aristocratic. In short, Amory wants what he is not. This life of the upper-class aristocratic parties and jazz ambiance is what enslaves Nick Carraway and subsequently drowns him in a nauseating storm of shadows instead of faces and names. Nick Carraway doesn't actually get to know the souls of those individuals he is seeking to encounter and ingratiate himself in for the purposes of his own aggrandizement. There was dancing now on the canvas in the garden, old men pushing young girls backwards in eternal, graceless circles, superior couples holding each other tortuously, fashionably, and keeping in the corners, and a great number of single girls dancing individualistically, or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or the traps. By midnight, the hilarity had increased. In this brave new world, human relations are not as important as material possessions to flaunt to the world to see. Human relations are simply a means to material possessions. When Gatsby gives a tour to Nick, he shows him what? His prized car. And, of course, throughout other tours, his many possessions, which mean nothing ultimately to him. As the two seemingly grow closer as friends, Nick is frustrated at Gatsby's superficiality. He had nothing to say, Nick laments. Gatsby chats and chatters about unimportant things, cars, books he has never read, which he owns only to make himself appear smarter, and the banal and mundane things of the world. Nick, it seems, though having moved to West Egg to have the life Gatsby is living, still desires something of human relations, deep souls, friendship, rather than encountering and meeting superficial robots like Gatsby. Amory Blaine, likewise, drifts from friend to friend and girl to girl. The world that Fitzgerald describes our Midwest expatriates finding themselves in is a world where forgetfulness and utilitarian ends dominate every part and parcel of existence. They had forgotten me, Nick Carraway also says, but Daisy glanced up and held out her hand. Gatsby didn't know me now at all. Nick leaves the two together. Three's a crowd. And all Gatsby really wants is to steal Daisy's heart back to him. No matter how many parties and friends he betrays and forgets in the process, everyone and everything is expendable. St. Augustine of Hippo, that great saint from North Africa, famously said that we are restless until our heart finds peace in the love of God, principally through the love of other persons, who incarnate the very love that is the essence of the divine. So too does Fitzgerald reveal to us the restless hearts of J. Gatsby and Amory Blaine, lost in the hissing and swirling cauldrons of the East, America's Carthage, in their desire for something beyond the material and jazzy lights, but, nevertheless, slaves to banal materialism and the unsubstantial life it confers to its disciples. Speaking of Gatsby, his heart was in a constant, turbulent riot. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. A universe of ineffable gaudiness spun itself out in his brain while the clock ticked on the washstand and the moon soaked with wet light his tangled clothes upon the floor. Amory, of course, moves from woman to woman, as we said, only to lose them all. Isabel, Rosalind, and Eleanor. Love eludes Amory Blaine. Love eludes J. Gatsby. Love eludes Nick Carraway. And we might add here, love eludes all of Fitzgerald's protagonists in his novels. Unlike with Augustine, there is no moment of loving rest for Gatsby and Amory or Fitzgerald's great protagonists in all of his works. Nick, meanwhile, becomes wrapped up in Gatsby's destructive drama and witnesses the fall of the great Gatsby. After Gatsby is murdered, virtually no one attends his funeral. All of those friends and dancing girls and rich men and their spouses ignore Gatsby. David Brooks would say that Gatsby lacked the eulogy virtues we look to in order to see the real character of men and women instead of the resume virtues, which are as superficial as the lives being lived in West Egg, Princeton, and the broader East Coast world that has defeated Nick Carraway, Amory Blaine, and ultimately killed Jay Gatsby. In this defeat, an unveiling of the American dream as a lie and illusion, Amory Blaine reaches his final apotheosis. He is defeated, but he doesn't die. And here is important wisdom coming from Fitzgerald in this moment of apotheosis. Having lost it all, having become disillusioned, and having found himself being driven by a wealthy man back to Princeton, Amory speaks on the virtues of socialism, how prescient all things considered, because we often hear this today by the same people who were at once, not long ago, seeking the richness, the great life, the fame, the fortune, and the celebrity of New York and LA, only to be defeated and disillusioned, and now turning to socialism and communism as the path out. But what causes Amory to argue socialism for the first time in his life? It is not his actual agreement with socialist philosophy. It is his restless heart. It is his having been defeated by the illusion of the East and the American dream, his inability to win the glory he previously thought he was destined for. It is a socialism that has emerged from bitterness and anger. It is, lastly, in his having failed to find love in another person. As we witness the love of friends and the love of spouse elude him. In the car, Amory says what we all sense today. My whole generation is restless. I'm sick of a system where the richest man gets the most beautiful girl if he wants her, where the artist without an income has to sell his talents to a button manufacturer. Even if I had talents, I'd not be content to work 10 years, condemned either to celibacy or a furtive indulgence to give some man's son an automobile. You can just hear, and you can taste the seething rage and the anger and the hatred coming from Amory Blaine, a Midwest transplant who thought he was marked for glory, only to be defeated, now bitter and angry at the very system he wanted to exploit for himself. Amory's outbursts come, of course, without the hope of theological reconciliation. Monsieur Darcy has died, and with him the opportunity to find love in God and peace in theology. With God out of the picture, and with the American dream out of the picture, all that Amory has left is socialism. The socialism that Amory argues for at the end of this side of paradise is the same kind of socialism that attracted Whittaker Chambers. It offered something to live or die for amid the ruins of doubt and illusion. It is the same kind of socialism that attracts defeated souls today, providing them with the interior substance they seek but cannot find in the empty shell of the American dream. F. Scott Fitzgerald's enduring relevance is found not in his conservatism and romanticism for the Midwestern ideal, though, as a great American literary scholar, Leo Marx, said, Fitzgerald does give a salute to that ideal. It is rather in Fitzgerald's recognition and realization of what laid ahead for America. Midwestern alienation and the ironic appeal of socialism from those who live in the moneyed regions of the United States. 100 years after Fitzgerald's great novels, we living today in the 21st century are very much living in the same world as Nick Carraway, Amory Blaine, and Jay Gatsby. We have crashed into the world of the flyover blues, the world of arguing socialism for the first time in our lives, while still trying to pick up the pieces of our restless heart and stitch it back together through the illusion of the American dream, socialism, and the false promise of the coastal paradise writ large. Fitzgerald may not have given us the answer to our problems, our malaise, but a century ago he saw where we are going. Or perhaps we have always been there without knowing it until now. In reading the great literature of F. Scott Fitzgerald, we also see his continuation of the critique that we saw in the great 19th century American writers. The illusion of hope, the false promise of American economic prosperity, the false reality of the self-created American atom. In Fitzgerald, he shows and deconstructs all that is false with the American ideology of progress, hope, and utopia. But in exposing and deconstructing the false image and the lies that are propagated to the American masses, what are we left with? Nothing but defeat and possibly death.